Thank you. Thank you so much. What a wonderful event this is. What an incredible group who is sponsoring this event. They have treated me so warmly, so wonderfully. They have really made me feel at home in a country that has been somewhat cool to me in other respects. But this organization has been as warm as anybody could possibly be. The friendship that we mutually feel for each other and for Norway, for Israel, for democratic values, for Judeo-Christian values, for Abrahamic values, for all the values that I think join us together in this room are so evident in the warm feelings here today. I've been asked to speak here about several subjects. I want to start by talking about the substance of the issues that are involved in the Middle East conflict. I want to talk particularly about international law as it relates to the Middle East. If the translator thinks I'm going too fast, please let me know and I will slow down. I come from Brooklyn where we talk very, very, very fast. And so I appreciate if you'll let me know if I'm going too fast. Let me first talk about international law. Then I would like to talk about the role of Norway in the peace process involving the Middle East and a range of other subjects. International law. What is international law? It's very, very different from domestic law. Everybody knows what the sources of Norwegian law are. You have a parliament, you elect your parliament, you have a fair system of representation. If you don't like the law, you elect other parliamentarians, they can change it. You are bound by the law of Norway through a social contract. You have agreed to be citizens, the Norwegian government has agreed to protect you, and you have agreed to comply with the law. This goes back to the earliest times of democratic theory. What is international law? International law is not democratic. That is, there is no international legislature that decides what the law is. International law is customary. It's elitist. It is formed by judges, some judges appointed by governments, some by the United Nations. It is formed by scholars. In that respect, it's a little bit like Sharia or Christian law or Talmudic law. It's an elite system which becomes accepted over time through practice. What are the criteria for deciding whether international law is appropriate? Because law is never self-defining. One of the oldest principles of Christianity is that you must make your own decisions. You render unto Caesar, to be sure, but you make your decisions as to whether law is moral, and you have to live by your own conscience and your own morality. That's true of every basic philosophy and every basic religion. I suggest there are three criteria for international law. The first and most important one is neutrality. It must be equally applicable to all parties without regard to who they are, without regard to how popular or unpopular they are. It must be neutrally and fairly applied. The second criteria is it must be predictable in advance. That is, you must be able to know if you're an actor how your conduct will be treated under the law. And third, it must be practical. That is, it must provide reasonable alternatives. Let me give you an example from the current disputes that are going on in the Middle East. You all were here when Israel had to go into Gaza to try to prevent rockets from hitting Sderot and killing many, many children and psychologically traumatizing others. Many in Norway and many in the international community condemned Israel for what it did, but nobody ever told Israel what it should have done. What should a country do that is having rockets directed at its children? What would Norway do? What would the citizens of Oslo demand if rockets were coming from a neighboring state? My president, Barack Obama, went to Sderot where the rockets were hitting and said, if the rockets were hitting my children's homes, I would do everything in my power to stop that, and I would expect that Israel will do the same. So the other criteria is providing reasonable alternatives to prohibited solutions. The great philosopher John Rawls, who for many years taught at Harvard and has influenced generations of philosophers today, came up with a very interesting, I would call it, gimmick for deciding whether law is valid, international law as well as domestic law. He said everybody should live under a veil of ignorance. Before you decide what the right rule should be, it's a variation of Kantian philosophy. Before you decide what a rule should be, you shouldn't know who you're going to be in the world in which the law is applied. You don't know whether you're a man or a woman, so you have to have laws that are fair to men and women. If you know you're a man, maybe the psychological inclination would be to favor men. You don't know whether you're black or white. You don't know whether you're tall or short. You don't know whether you're physically challenged or physically fit. You don't know whether you're gay or homosexual. You don't know whether you're born into Christianity or Islam or Judaism, or your parents gave you no religious training. You just don't know who you're going to be in the world, and you have to come up with a system of rules that would be fair to everybody. What a wonderful test. Now, could international law today pass that test? Let's apply several criteria of international law to some of the most contentious issues in the Middle East today. So you all know that there is a tremendous opposition in Norway and in many other places to what is called the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. By the way, that's not the way the occupation is defined in academia here in Norway. Probably many of you know about the petition that was circulated and got 191 signatures of professors at Trondheim and other universities. It talks about the occupation. Let me read you the first sentence. Since 1948, the state of Israel has occupied Palestine. This is not about 1967. This is about the very existence of the state of Israel. When I spoke last night at the university, one of the women students said, I favor the petition. And I said, are you aware the petition calls for the abolition of the state of Israel? She said, no, I thought it meant only the 1967 occupation. So when you use the word occupation, you have to be very careful. The enemies of Israel slide in a very sneaky way the word occupation into delegitimation of Israel's very right to exist. They believe that Israel's control of even 1 square inch of land, the size of a postage stamp, is an occupation and would be illegal and would be in violation of Sharia law or violation of Arab rights. But let's talk about the occupation. Is there an occupation? Start with 1948 and then go to 1967. Of course there's no occupation in 1948. In 1948, when the UN made its decision to divide that land, many Jews lived in what was then called Palestina from the Romans, and many Arabs lived there. Jews had a majority in some parts of the country. Arabs had a majority in other parts of the country. They didn't call themselves Palestinians then, but they called themselves local Arabs. They had a majority in other parts of the country. The United Nations, after looking at the Peel Commission, at the Balfour Declaration, and a range of other League of Nations declarations, decided the fair thing to do would be to give the Jewish state an area where it had a majority of the population, mostly along the coast. It had built Tel Aviv from scratch. There had been nothing there but sand dunes. Of course Tel Aviv was going to be a Jewish city and part of Israel. Much of the rest would be Arab. Arabs got 65% of the arable land. The Jews got 35% of the arable land. And then nobody really wanted the Negev, and the Jews insisted on getting the Negev because they thought they could rebuild it and make green the sand of the Negev. That seemed like a fair resolution. That's not occupation. That's compromise. Certainly it's less severe than what happened in Czechoslovakia, where 3 million Sudeten Germans who had lived in the what is now Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, what was then Czechoslovakia, had lived there for 300 years, were immediately ethnically cleansed and made to leave in the interests of peace. That was a real ethnic cleansing and occupation. What about what the Russians did in Kaliningrad, where they had no control over ever historically, but they won it in a war against the Germans, and they kicked out 2 million Germans, and they put in 1 million Russians, and now it's Russian territory. There have been many occupations. The occupation of Tibet by China, the occupation of Chechnya by Russia, the occupation of so many other areas, Kurdish areas, Armenian areas. But when you hear about the occupation with a capital T and a capital O, one thinks about only one occupation. One never hears, for example, about the Jordanian occupation of the West Bank between 1949 and 1967. One never hears about the Egyptian occupation of the Gaza Strip, a brutal, brutal occupation. It was called an open-air prison where Arabs were treated horribly by the Egyptian, by their brothers and cousins. You never hear about that as the occupation. There's only one occupation now, two, 48 to the current or 67 to the current. Let's talk about the 48 issue is really not worth talking about. It's so absurd. No country in history has ever had a more legitimate birth than Israel. Israel's birth certificate is more legal than the birth certificate of the United States, of Australia, of Canada. Those countries started simply by colonialism and occupation. Israel was formed by law, by an enactment of the League of Nations, by an enactment of the United Nations, by legislative actions in the United States, Great Britain, France, recognition by the entire world, including, of course, Norway. So its birth is not in dispute. It is a legitimate country, and among the nations of the world, has the same legitimacy as every other country in the world. So let's talk about 1967. What happened in 1967? We don't have to talk about the Gaza too much because the Gaza has, of course, been given back. What happened on the West Bank? Of course, Israel did not attack Jordan. Israel was not at war with Jordan. In fact, Israel sent a prominent Norwegian general to speak to King Hussein and to plead with King Hussein not to attack Israel. He made an incredible offer through the Israelis made an incredible offer through the Norwegian general. If you don't attack us, we will not take 1 inch of land from you. We will not take the Western Wall back, even though the Western Wall is the holiest place in Judaism, has been a Jewish iconic holy place since the destruction of the temple. We will not take that back. We will not take back the Jewish quarter, which has been in Jewish hands essentially since the days of Abraham. You walk through the Jewish quarter, many of you have done so. You see the signs all around you. You see the streets. You see the excavation showing the temple period, showing the Talmudic period. You walk a little further out, you see the Via Dolorosa. You see every step that Jesus took. You see the connections between Judaism and Christianity. It's so deep and so passionate and so compelling. But Israel said, we're not taking that back because no life is worth spending even on a holy object. Israel's position. What was King Hussein's position? He quoted it to the Norwegian general. He said, my answer will come in the battlefield. He fired 1,500 rockets into downtown Jerusalem at civilians. The Israelis had no option but to respond. They did. They captured the West Bank. That was in June of 1967. You wouldn't know this if you went to a university in Norway today. But what happened in July of 1967? What happened is the Israeli government, through Moshe Dayan, made an offer to the Palestinians. The offer was, we will give you back every inch of land captured if you just make peace with us. Just give us peace and you get your land back. Peace for land, land for peace. The Arabs all went to Khartoum to have a conference. They issued their 3 famous no's. No peace, no recognition, no negotiation. At that point, what was Israel to do? Israel had to hold on to that land in an effort to try to negotiate peace. As Abba Eban said in response to the Khartoum Declaration, it's the first time in history that the winners in a defensive war have sued for peace and the losers have demanded unconditional surrender. Or as he put it another time, the Palestinians don't know how to take yes for an answer. They were offered the land back. They said, no, no, no. The Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And this was one opportunity they missed in 1967. The opportunity didn't go away. The opportunity didn't go away. 1993, the Oslo Accords. This is the last time Oslo will ever serve, unfortunately, as a place of accord between Israel and the Arabs. There will never be another peace process in Oslo. Oslo has lost its role as a neutral arbiter between Israel and the Palestinians, unfortunately, because the Oslo Accords, I think, held enormous promise. And the Norwegian government and the Norwegian people should be very proud that it was selected as a place where Nobel Prizes could be won in Oslo, not only presented in Oslo, but won in Oslo, and several Nobel Prizes were won because of the Oslo Accords. A very, very proud and potentially constructive moment, but nothing really came of it. Why? Because building on the Oslo Accords, President Clinton and Ehud Barak offered the Palestinians everything they had ever dreamed for in 2000, 2001, 100% of the Gaza, 95 to 97% of the West Bank, and in exchange for the 3 to 5% land in other areas of the country to make up for it, to compensate for the fact that Israel had in fact built neighborhoods that could not be torn down in Ma'ale Adumim and Gilo and other areas right outside of Jerusalem. They offered a divided Jerusalem. You know how painful that was? It's like cutting out your own heart. Jerusalem, the heart and soul of the Jewish people. I grew up as an Orthodox Jew. 3 times a day I prayed to return to Jerusalem. Im eshkachech Yerushalayim. If I forget Jerusalem, may my tongue cleave to my mouth. May my right hand lose its cunning. The 2 things Jews pray for more than anything else is Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, and Shalom, peace. That's all you hear. You go to a synagogue, every word, if you only know 2 words in Hebrew, Yerushalayim and Shalom, you can sit in a synagogue on a Friday night, a Saturday, a Jewish holiday, and you will hear over and over again, Shalom, Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim, Shalom. And yet Israel was prepared, in the interests of Shalom, peace, to give up parts of its heritage in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. And yet the Palestinians turned it down. The Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia, shook his finger at Arafat and said to him, if you turn down this offer, you are committing a crime against the Palestinian people. And Yasser Arafat committed that crime against the Palestinian people. Then he compounded it, because he went back to his bunker and called for an intifada. And the intifada resulted in 5,000 unnecessary deaths. 1,000 Israelis were killed, babies, children, people going to pizza parlors, adults, emigres from Russia who were dancing in the Dolphinarium on a weekend night, blown to pieces. And 4,000 Palestinians were killed. It was a terrible, terrible tragedy. The blood of those victims are on the hands of Yasser Arafat and on the hands of those who turned down the peace offer in 2000 and 2001. And then it was repeated. And then it was repeated. Ehud Olmert offered in 2007 and 2008 virtually the same thing, and the Palestinians again walked away. Why did the Palestinians walk away from these deals? I can give you an answer in one word. Norway. Norway is the reason the Palestinians walk away from deals that require them to compromise. Why? Because Norway has told the Palestinians very simply, you don't have to compromise. You don't have to do anything. We will recognize the PLO. We will give you ambassadorial status. We'll recognize your state. We'll give you everything you want. You don't have to give Israel anything. You don't have to negotiate. We will give you what you want without you doing anything in return. Norway. That's the problem. The problem is governments who are prepared to tell the Palestinians, we will demand everything of Israel. We'll boycott them if they don't do what we want. But of you, the Palestinians, we demand nothing. You just sit still. We'll give you what you want, as if you're the only country ever occupied. What's the difference between the occupation of the West Bank and the occupation of China, the occupation of Tibet by China, the occupation of Chechnya? There are several differences. One, the Palestinians have gotten attention through terrorism. The Chechens and the Tibetans, for the most part, have not. Two, the Palestinians have allies who have oil, and their enemy is Israel. Their perceived enemy is Israel. And the other third difference is Israel has offered to end the occupation. None of these other countries have. Has China ever made an offer to Tibet? Has Russia ever made an offer to Chechnya? No. The Palestinians are sitting on an offer right now. Just this week, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said to the Palestinians on a CNN interview with Piers Morgan, come to Jerusalem, invite me to Ramallah unconditionally. Let's negotiate. You will get the land. You will get 90-something%, and we will give you the others in return. We'll have to negotiate hard about Jerusalem. We'll have to negotiate hard about some rights of return or refugee status, but at the borders, we can figure them out. Come and negotiate. And the Palestinians won't sit down to negotiate to get their land. Who ever heard of that? I'm a lawyer. I negotiate all the time. And when I negotiate, I don't say I'm refusing to sit down when I want a position, when I want something. When you want something, you sit down and negotiate. You don't impose preconditions for negotiation. So is Israel in compliance or out of compliance with Resolution 242 of the UN? You read that, you hear about that, all the questions I was asked at the universities, 242, 242. I know a little bit about Resolution 242. I was there when it was drafted. I was Arthur Goldberg's law clerk when he was on the Supreme Court. He called me to the Waldorf Astoria during the negotiations for 242 and asked me to help him with the draftsmanship and the wording. I know what happened. I know the debates that occurred. And the end result of the 242 debate was that Britain and the United States insisted that the word territories be put in 242, not the territories, not all the territories. In other words, they adopted essentially what was then called the Allon Plan. Israel would be permitted to make small territorial changes to avoid what had been called the Auschwitz borders, the borders that would assure the death of Jews, and that would be part of it. And this was the most important thing that people who talk about 242 without reading it don't understand. There are mutual obligations under 242. Israel is supposed to return territories captured, but only when the Arab states in the area recognize its right to live in peace. Without recognition and peace, there is no obligation to return 1 dunam of land. There are no unilateral obligations in 242. They are mutual obligations, and Israel has complied with every one of them. The minute Egypt extended a hand of peace, it returned every inch of land in the Sinai. Every inch. You want to know something? It tried to give back the Gaza Strip, but Sadat was too smart to take it. He said, we don't want the Gaza Strip. In fact, Jimmy Carter writes in one of his books that the deal almost fell apart because Israel was being too generous. It wanted to give back not only the Sinai, but the Gaza Strip. In any event, there was a little dispute about 1 acre of land right near Eilat on the Egyptian side of the border that Israel had built up and put in a beautiful hotel with gambling. And so the Israelis said, look, we put all the money into that, we should get that area. The Egyptians said, no, it's traditional Egyptian land. And what do you think they did? They didn't go to war. They didn't plant bombs in each other's buses. They said, let's have an international negotiation. They brought in 3 distinguished international negotiators. Those international negotiators resolved the case against Israel in favor of Egypt. What did Israel do? Did it say no? No, it said yes. It gave the land back. It did it peacefully. What happened with Jordan? When Israel made peace with Jordan, Jordan claimed a few little areas. It had ceded the rest of the land to the Palestinians, but it had claimed a few little areas. Israel immediately gave those areas back. So Israel has complied 100% with 242. And as soon as the Palestinians are prepared to make peace and recognize Israel's right to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people and to forswear violence, which is obliged under 242, Israel has offered to give back that land. So who's not in compliance with 242? Let me tell you who's not in compliance with 242. Syria, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. All the countries that haven't made peace with Israel are not in compliance with 242. Israel is in compliance with 242. And that's a myth that has to be exposed, but you wouldn't know that if you went to the universities here in Norway, because books that make that case are not even permitted in the university. I was told today that a group of people offered to send my book, The Case for Israel, free of charge, in Norwegian, to the various university libraries in Norway, and the offer was declined. Students should not be exposed to such controversial teachings like the two-state solution and peace and end of the settlements that I advocate in my book. So that's the occupation under international law. Let's talk about how Israel responds to rocket attacks and to terrorism. That's been a major source of controversy, obviously. Israel does respond. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said yesterday, after the terrible bus explosion that could have killed 50 people, children, injured 30, killed 1, a bomb with ball bearings. You know, the bombs aren't just bombs, explosions. They put ball bearings to kill as many civilians as possible. Often they soak the ball bearings in rat poison in order to prevent coagulation. Rat poison is an anticoagulant, makes it much harder to treat. At one point, they were even trying to use various diseases, biological warfare, in the bombs in order to make it more difficult for first responders to be able to get to the scene and treat without themselves having been exposed to disease. And as you know, in many of the bombings, what happened is first one bomb goes off, and then the first responders come, and as soon as the first responders come, a second bomb goes off to kill the first responders, to make it much more difficult for first responders to come. So, and Netanyahu announced the other day that there will be repercussions. Every democracy would. If there were buses, God forbid, exploding in downtown Oslo, believe me, the Norwegian government would be diverting its planes from Libya and bringing them back here and saying, let's protect the citizens of Norway. That's the first obligation of every democracy. When I went to Sderot with my wife, who's here today with me, and we were there on the holiday of Purim, the holiday of Queen Esther, 2 years ago or so, and a rocket hit not far from where we were. It was really scary. My wife, who's a neuropsychologist and deals with a lot of adolescent children, told me she saw a case of traumatic stress syndrome among thousands of people. Every kid was stressed. You have to be 9 seconds away from a shelter. You can't go to a dance, you can't play soccer, you can't go to the movies. You have to be 9 seconds away from a shelter, otherwise you'll be killed if a rocket hits. So what are you supposed to do when there are rocket attacks? And now there are increasing rocket attacks. And now there are murders. The Fogel family murdered. Why were they murdered? Because Israel eliminated checkpoints in order to try to make peace. It made it easier for terrorists to come in the middle of the night to Ithamar and kill a family of 5 people in cold blood. By the way, let me take a pause. When I spoke yesterday at the university and I talked about the killing of the Fogel family, some student in the back who identified himself as a Palestinian student said, well, there's no difference. Israel kills children too. And so I asked the audience, I said, how many of you in this audience believe in the distinction between a person who kills, deliberately setting out to murder a child, walking into a house with his goal to slit the child's throat, to stab him in the heart, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a government that fires rockets at terrorists, trying very hard to avoid civilian casualties, but inadvertently kills a child? How many think there's a difference? Most of the audience raised their hand, but a large number of students, most of whom who identified themselves as pro-Palestinian, said, no, there was no difference. There was no difference. And I said, have you ever read the Bible? The first obligation in the Bible when the people of Israel come to the land of Israel is they must build cities of refuge. What is a city of refuge? An Ir Miklat, a city of refuge. It's a place where the accidental manslaughterer may go and hide out and be protected against the blood avenger. The Bible makes a sharp distinction between deliberate killing and killing that is inadvertent. The Quran makes that distinction. St. Augustine, in his brilliant writings on just war, is the basic distinction. It is never, ever legally, morally, ethical, deliberately to set out to kill an innocent human being. But it is permissible to achieve an object of saving life, to take an action which you know might have the effect of killing an innocent human being as long as you apply the rules of proportionality. Does Israel apply the rules of proportionality? We have one of the great witnesses here today who will speak to you later this afternoon, one of my heroes, a man who speaks the truth to power, Colonel Kemp, who has had experience, more than all of us in this room together, in fighting difficult fights about urban warfare. And he has offered testimony to the Goldstone Report, tragically rejected by the Goldstone Commission, that would have said, and I'll leave him to say it in his own words, but that Israel's efforts to prevent civilian casualties is essentially unmatched in modern history by those of any other army. And I hope, and I think, by the way, the armies that are going into Libya today are learning from Israel. They are using every effort at their disposal to avoid civilian casualties. I know the American and British forces in Afghanistan are trying to avoid civilian casualties, but inevitably there are civilian casualties. When you go after a terrorist and inadvertently, because the intelligence was bad or because something suddenly happens, a civilian shows up and tragically is killed, that's not murder. That's not a violation of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments doesn't say thou shalt not kill. It says lo tirtzach, thou shalt not murder. Murder means willful killing, deliberate, intentional killing. It doesn't mean warfare. Every religion, every philosophy permits warfare to protect and defend the lives of the innocent. So what should Israel have done? It should try to reduce casualties, and it's done so. Even before it went into Gaza, what it tried to do is use surgical military actions called targeted killings. It went after terrorists, and the Israeli Supreme Court, the only Supreme Court in history ever to take this issue up and decide what is a legitimate target in the war against terrorism, they gave a very narrow definition of who is a combatant in an urban warfare setting. A combatant is only somebody who basically is on the way to committing an act of terrorism. If a combatant commits an act of terrorism and then goes back to his home at night and is not going to do it again, he's not a target according to the Israeli Supreme Court. So Israel tried to target only people who were engaged in the acts of killing their children. Sometimes they failed. When General Shkedi, one of the great Air Force generals in modern history, came to head the Israeli Air Force, he saw that the ratio of civilians to terrorists killed was about 1-to-1. That is, for every terrorist killed, there was a civilian killed. That had been a very good ratio. The United States in the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan had a rule that if the ratio goes higher than 30 civilians for every terrorist, you have to get special presidential authorization. And of course, when we went after Saddam Hussein, we were prepared to go higher than the 1-to-30 ratio if we really knew we could get Hussein. I suspect we would be willing to go higher than the 1-to-30 ratio if we can get Osama bin Laden. But that's the ratio, 1-to-30, that was quoted on a 60-minute report in the United States. The Israeli ratio was 1-to-1. General Shkedi said that's not good enough. That's not good enough. He changed the rules of engagement. He commissioned the development of different munitions. He forbore going after certain very horrible terrorists because there might be civilians in the area. And by the time he left office, he had changed the ratio so that for every 29 terrorists killed, only 1 civilian died. The best ratio in the history of warfare. If you don't believe me, just Google it. In Haaretz, which is the most radical, most anti-Israel newspaper in Israel, it told the story, it gave the statistics, it did the study, it came to the conclusion that this ratio was absolutely remarkable. Now let me tell you the irony. If General Shkedi appeared on this platform with me today, he would be immediately arrested in this city and tried as a war criminal. On the other hand, if the head of Hamas walked into this room today, he could walk freely into the city and walk through the streets of Oslo. That's true in London. And General Shkedi, now retired from the Air Force, is the head of El Al. He flies all over the world. He's obviously a pilot. He cannot fly to London because he has been subject to threats of arrest in London. I have offered him. I said, please, fly to London with me. We will walk out of the plane together. Hold your head up. Let them arrest you. We will put together the greatest international team of lawyers ever assembled, and we will put the world on trial. And we will defend you, and we will defend Israel, and we will show the world that no country has ever done more to protect civilians. No country has ever had a better ratio than Israel. Let them put you on trial. You have nothing to fear. I hope that will happen. So how does current law fare when it comes to these issues? It fails. What I call the attempts to use law today against Israel, I call it guerrilla lawfare. It's an attempt to use the law only in a way that terrorists today use violence, directed only at the one country that probably tries harder than any other country. One country that has the best Supreme Court, the most activist Supreme Court, that regulates Israeli conduct on a day-to-day basis in the middle of battles. Who's ever heard of this? In the middle of battles, the Israeli Supreme Court will stop and grant an injunction. Let me tell you what happened. In the battle for Jenin, there was a very difficult battle. Some organizations brought a lawsuit about a policy that Israel had toward, it was called the neighbor policy. When you go into a home that has terrorists, what Israel did is they would have a local Palestinian, and they would hold a local Palestinian in front, and they would walk up to the house using him as a shield. The Israeli Supreme Court said no, and issued an injunction saying you cannot do that, even if it means saving the lives of Israelis. I've never heard of another court intervening in the middle of a battle to do an injunction. The same thing with the killing and targeted killings. The Israeli Supreme Court took that case. The Israeli Supreme Court took the case involving can you use moderate torture to find a ticking bomb terrorist and where he's planted the bomb. The Israeli Supreme Court said no. The United States Supreme Court ducked the issue, wouldn't take the case, wouldn't take most of those cases. And so current law fails. It fails miserably. It applies a double standard. And when I talk about the double standard, you know what the university students, for the most part, say? They say, well, you know, you might be right. You might be right that there are other countries that are worse, but we're talking about Israel now. Stick to the subject. And I'm reminded of the story of President Lowell, who was a very bigoted president of Harvard University in the 1910s and 1920s. He didn't like the fact that too many Jews were applying to Harvard, so he imposed a very small quota. And to justify the quota, he said, Jews cheat. And one of the great alumni, Learned Hand, wrote to him and said, Mr. President, Protestants cheat too. And Lowell said, you're changing the subject. We're talking about Jews now. And that's what happens at the UN. We're changing the subject. We're talking about Israel now, but that's all they talk about at the UN. In the last 50 years, Israel has had more resolutions condemning it than all of the other nations of the world combined. Who have been the victims? Not Israel. Israel's fine. It has the sixth strongest army in the world. It can protect itself. It can defend itself. Let me tell you who the victims are of this double standard. The victims of this double standard are the 2 to 4 million people who were killed in Cambodia when the UN did nothing, when Noam Chomsky praised Pol Pot and said there was no genocide going on. You know what the UN was doing in 1975 when 2 to 4 million people were being murdered by Pol Pot in Cambodia? They were debating that Zionism equals racism. That was the debate at the UN. Not a single debate, not a single resolution on Cambodia during that entire year. Not a single condemnation until after it was over. A little bit too late. What happened in Rwanda? What happened in Darfur? Go back and look at the debates that were going on at the UN Human Rights Council and its predecessor during the genocides in Rwanda and Darfur. They were debating Israel. They debate Israel all the time. That's all they do. The UN Human Rights Council has a commission on women. Guess who sits in the chair this year of the UN Council of Human Rights on Women? No, not Norway. No, not Israel. No, not the United States. Iran. It was a tough fight. Iran had to beat out Libya. Libya used to serve on the Human Rights Council. They were finally thrown out. Who serves on the Human Rights Council of the UN? Violators of human rights. They serve on the council in order to give themselves exculpatory immunity from any condemnation. And they spend their time condemning Israel over and over and over again. That's the way the UN operates. You have to ask yourself the question, why? Why Israel? I'm reminded of the terrible joke of what happened when Hitler was giving a rally at Nuremberg, and he yells out at the top of his voice, who is causing all the problems of Germany? Expecting the audience would say the Jews. And an old man in the back yells out, the bicycle riders. Hitler looks aghast and says, why the bicycle riders? And the old man yells, why the Jews? And that's the question. Why the Jewish state? Why Israel? Why does it get all the attention of the world? Can you criticize Israel? Of course, you should criticize Israel. I'm a patriotic, loyal American. I spend most of my time criticizing America. Many of you criticize Norway. You should criticize your own country. You should criticize other countries. Israel deserves criticism for some of the actions it takes. Israel only gets a B- when it comes to human rights, but it lives in a world of Ds and Fs. And there have to be comparative analysis. There must be improvements in Israel. If I were an Israeli, I might very well belong to B'Tselem, an organization that's very critical of Israel. But what right does a Norwegian young man or a Norwegian woman sitting up in Trondheim or in Bergen, what right do they have to focus only on Israel? They have no such right. If you're an Israeli, you have that right. Maybe if you're a Palestinian, you have that right. But if you're an outsider, you have to pick the worst first. You have to go after the most serious violators first. And who do you go after second? Second, you go after those countries that have no internal mechanisms for dissent, that have no opportunity to bring it to the attention of the courts or to the attention of the media. Where does Israel rank? A, it is one of the best records on human rights, B-, but one of the best records. And in terms of internal mechanisms of dissent, the best. There's no country better. There's much more dissent and disagreement in Israel than there is in Norway. Try to find a Norwegian newspaper that presents a pro-Israel perspective. So much for dissent. Your foreign minister has a wonderful article in the New York Review of Books, Why We Must Talk. Why the essence of Norway is dialogue, dialogue, dialogue. We talk to Hamas. We won't talk to Dershowitz. We won't talk to any pro-Israel professor. We won't talk to any pro-Israel speaker. Dialogue. The dialogue goes one way, but it doesn't include mainstream pro-Israel supporters. That's the nature of dialogue today in Norway, unfortunately. I'm writing a book. Thank you. I'm beginning to work on a new book. It's called The Second 6 Million. Its thesis is very simple. It says, it argues that since 1945, when we swore never again, 6 million people have been murdered in preventable genocides. I mentioned them: Cambodia, Rwanda, Darfur, Eritrea. The list goes on and on and on. And during that period of time, the only country that has been the subject of international universal condemnation has been Israel. And it's a terrible tragedy. It's a terrible tragedy. When you go to universities like I did, and you ask students, where were you on Darfur? Where were you on Rwanda? Where were you on Gaddafi until recently? Where were you on Mubarak? You know where we were? We were at anti-Israel demonstrations. That's where we were. We were too busy condemning Israel to think about the real victims of human rights violations. And yet Israel, despite how hard it tries and how well it generally succeeds, it's the only country in the world to be described today as apartheid. Apartheid? Has anybody been to Israel recently and seen what a mixed society it is? You know, the 3 judges that sentenced the former president of Israel to 7 years in prison for rape, the 3 judges included an Arab and 2 women. That's real apartheid. You can imagine Bishop Tutu sitting on a jury in apartheid South Africa, sitting in condemnation of President de Klerk. No, that wouldn't happen. My wife and I recently went to a concert in Jerusalem being conducted by Daniel Barenboim, and half the orchestra consisted of Palestinians, most from the West Bank, half of them of Israelis. They played the Mozart 2-piano concerto with Barenboim, a Jew, playing one side of the piano, and a young Arab, brilliant young Arab pianist, Palestinian pianist, sang on the other side. The man sitting next to me at the concert was Israel's Minister of Culture in the cabinet, an Arab. Sitting a few rows behind was a Supreme Court justice, an Arab. Sitting in the audience as well were 12, 15 members of the Knesset, Israeli Arabs. Is Israel's treatment of its Arab population perfect? No. Is Norway's treatment of its Muslim population perfect? No. Is America's treatment of its black population perfect, despite the fact that we have a black president? No. Every country has to struggle much more for racial equality, for gender equality, for sexual orientation equality, for better environmental control. Israel struggles in each of those areas. It's the only country in the Middle East. Let me make a categorical statement here today. Israel is the only country in the Middle East that is not an apartheid state. Amen. Not an apartheid state. Think of every other country. Every other country has gender apartheid. Every other country has sexual orientation apartheid. We're learning a lot now about Bahrain, which has apartheid between Sunnis and Shias, where the Sunni narrow leadership is imposing apartheid on the Shias. We see the opposite in other parts of the world. Every single Muslim country practices religious apartheid. does not allow Christians to practice their religion openly. There's one country in the Middle East where Christianity is thriving today, Israel. The only country which has increases in Christian population. And I hope more Christians move to Israel and more Christians visit Israel. Israel and Christianity have a tremendous amount in common. A, the birthplace of both religions. B, religions of tolerance and love and peace. Religions that have brought so much to the world. Islam is a great religion too, if only the people who today speak in the name of Islam would look to its core and look to what the word Islam means and even what the word jihad means and give it its true meaning rather than a political meaning and a military meaning. There's material in all of our holy books, whether it be the Jewish Bible, the Christian Bible, the Quran. There's material in each of our books that can be interpreted in multiple ways. It's not a question of what the text says. It's a question of how the people who live it, and what words they take seriously, and what they interpret, and what they take out of these holy books. And we can work together to make sure that our common tradition works toward peace and works toward harmony. And I'm hoping that the people of Norway will fulfill their great tradition. Norway has the highest levels of aspiration of virtually any country I've ever been to. It aspires very high. It claims to apply a very high standard. It uses wonderful concepts of human rights, equality, dialogue, speech, but I wish it would do a better job of complying in an even-handed way with many of these principles. In the past 15 or 20 years, I'm afraid that many of this society, many in the academy, many in the media, many among politicians, have blinded themselves to the reality and complexity of what is going on in the Middle East today. And I'm confident that the organization sponsoring this event and events like this one will prick the conscience of the good and decent people of Norway, the people who came to the rescue of Jews during the Shoah, the people who resisted efforts by Quisling and others to impose Nazism on the good people of Norway, the people who have showed an independent spirit, an independent pioneering spirit from the beginning of recorded history. My wife and I just came from the Viking Museum. It was an inspiration to see the origins of this country and how Vikings landed in North America. And we're so proud of the combination. I grew up in a neighborhood of Jews and Norwegians who lived together in Brooklyn. And we were such good friends. We worked together so closely. I hope we continue to work together peacefully. I hope we can continue to work together constructively. And I hope in the end we will bring about shalom, salem, and peace. Thank you very much.